These dogs once saved lives, detected explosives, and put their own bodies between danger and their handlers. When the war ended, they were not honored, but treated like broken equipment. They were locked inside cold kennels, trembling with fear and loneliness, waiting to be sold, while money blinded people to the sacrifices these dogs made with their lives. Until one Navy SEAL said something no one was ready to hear. "I will adopt every retired K9 dog, all of them." Tell us where you're watching from, like and subscribe. One follow helps us bring more stories like this. Now let's begin the story. Mason Rourke arrived in the North the way a man steps into a church after years of shouting quietly, as if the walls might remember his sins. The town had a name that sounded like something you could exhale: Briar Hollow. It sat tucked between dark pines and a wide, frozen lake that caught the winter sun and threw it back in clean shards of light. The air smelled like iron and snow and sap, the kind of cold that didn't menace so much as insist. Mason wore the same thing he always wore now because civilian wardrobe felt like a costume he hadn't earned. A worn olive-gray tactical combat shirt, softened by time and scrubbed pale at the seams, the cuffs and shoulders faintly frayed. Under it, a dark red thermal layer that looked almost too alive beneath the muted cloth. His combat pants, a old and earth-toned brown mixed with mossy green, hung practical and loose, the knees scuffed, the cargo pocket sagging slightly from habit. His work boots were scratched and salt-stained, and on his left wrist, an old military watch ticked like a small, stubborn heartbeat. He looked built for movement, not posing. About 6 feet tall, compact strength, no wasted bulk. His face was clean-shaven, shaved close enough that the cold could find every contour square jaw, defined cheekbones, the kind of structure that didn't soften when he smiled, because he didn't often remember to. His hair was dark brown, trimmed in a military cut that had grown out just a fraction longer than regulation, as if time had tried to loosen him and failed. His skin was light, but weathered. Wind darkened from northern cold, and his eyes, gray-green, had a steady, unblinking alertness that made people feel seen without being judged. He had learned how to look at terrible things without flinching. And that skill didn't turn off. Beside him walked Sable, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a coat like winter itself cream at the chest and underside, gray along the flanks, black shading the back and muzzle. He moved with the focused economy of a working dog. Head low, ears attentive, paws placing themselves as if the ground were something to be read. His eyes were amber, bright against the dark mask of his face, and he wore a black harness with a dark red trim that flashed subtly when light hit it, like a thin line of warmth stitched into the cold. People often asked if Sable was friendly. Mason never knew how to answer. Sable wasn't friendly. Sable was true. They rented a small cabin at the edge of town from Sarah Klein, the kind of landlord who didn't need to raise her voice because her presence did it for her. Sarah was in her early 50s, tall and wiry, was with silver blonde hair pulled into a practical knot and cheeks browned from winter wind. Her hands were rough in a way that suggested she repaired things herself, and her eyes, pale blue, sharp, missed nothing. She had the calm manner of someone who'd watched storms pass and learned not to panic. "You can pay me whenever you can," she'd said, leaning against the porch rail, studying him like a person studies a bridge before driving across it. "Just don't lie to me. That's the only thing I charge interest on." Mason had nodded. The words "thank you" sat awkwardly in his throat. He still used gratitude like unfamiliar gear. Sarah's gaze had flicked to Sable. "And you," she'd added, crouching just far enough away to be respectful. "You look like you know the difference between a man who's lost and a man who's hiding." Sable had blinked slowly, then sat. A small, almost solemn decision. Well, that was the first time Mason felt the faintest loosening in his chest, like a knot, admitting it could someday become a bow again. On the third morning, the sun came up bright enough to make the snow sparkle like scattered glass. Mason walked into town with Sable at his side, boots crunching, breath visible, the lake gleaming through the trees like a sheet of hammered metal. He'd taken a temporary job at a place Sarah had mentioned over coffee. Northwind K9. Retirement and training. A small center tucked near the tree line where working dogs could be rehabilitated, adopted, or simply allowed to rest. Mason told himself he'd be there a few weeks. A way to keep his hands busy. A way to be around beings who understood silence. The building itself looked cheerful fresh paint, wide windows, a sign shaped like a paw print. The yard was clean, fences straight, the kind of order that suggested someone was trying hard to make peace look simple. Inside, and the warmth smelled like disinfectant and kibble and old leather honest smells, not pretty ones. A young receptionist named Lena Ortiz greeted him. Lena was in her mid-20s, short and energetic, with dark curly hair piled into a messy bun and warm brown skin dusted with freckles. Her hoodie was 2 sizes too big, her smile quick, and she spoke with the bright impatience of someone determined to make the world kinder through sheer speed. "You're Mason, right?" she said, eyes darting from his face to his posture like she was reading a list. Sarah called. "She said you're capable." Mason's mouth twitched. "She said that?" Lena nodded solemnly. "She also said you don't talk much. That's fine. We have dogs who talk enough for both of us." Sable sniffed the air, then leaned slightly toward Mason's leg, not fear, not clinginess. A subtle alignment, like a compass needle finding north. A man in a flannel jacket walked past, carrying a mop bucket. Gordon Pike, late 60s. It was thick-shouldered and slow-moving, his beard gray and trimmed short. His hands were huge, his knuckles swollen with age and work, and his eyes were gentle in a way that made Mason suspect he'd once been less gentle and had chosen to change. He paused, nodded at Mason, then nodded at Sable with more respect than he'd shown the human. "Good dog," Gordon murmured, like it was a title. Sable didn't wag. He simply watched Gordon pass, head tilting slightly, cataloging. Mason followed Lena toward the back where the kennels were. Dogs barked, whined, thumped tails. The sound hit Mason like an unexpected crowd, too many emotions at once. He breathed through it, steady. In his mind, noise had always meant danger. Here, it meant life. They passed a storage corridor with a door marked Supplies. It was unremarkable. A plain metal door, a scuffed handle. Nothing sacred. Sable stopped. Not a dramatic stop. Not a pull or a lunge. Just halted, mid-step, as if the air had thickened. His ears rose. His posture stiffened. His gaze locked on the supply door. Mason glanced down. "What is it?" Sable didn't look at him. He didn't bark. He didn't scratch. He simply stood there, nose slightly lifted, breathing in slow, measured draws that seemed too deliberate to be curiosity. Lena noticed and laughed softly. "Oh, don't mind that. Dogs do weird things. Maybe a mouse." Mason stared at the door anyway. The hallway felt colder here, though the heating vents hummed. He'd learned to listen to small changes. A quiet click, a different echo. The way hair rose on your arms before you knew why. He reached out, touched the door with 2 knuckles. Metal. Cold. Ordinary. Sable's chest vibrated with something close to a growl, but it never became sound. Mason stepped back. "We'll come back." Lena shrugged and continued walking. "If he starts paying rent, we'll give him his own office." Mason followed, but the feeling stayed with him like a pinprick under skin. Later, while Mason was stacking bags of food in the rear storeroom, Sable wandered out of sight for less than a minute. Mason didn't panic. He didn't call out. He didn't chase. He simply stopped moving. A reflex born from years where silence was the first warning, not the last. Then Sable returned, walking with a strange deliberation, and set something at Mason's feet. A small strip of dark red fabric, frayed at one end. It was the same shade as the trim on Sable's harness, but this was older, stiffer, and it carried a faint chemical smell Mason couldn't place. Sable sat, stared at Mason, blinked once. Mason crouched and picked up the strip. The fabric was cold, as if it had been somewhere unheated, somewhere sealed, somewhere forgotten. He looked up toward the corridor. Sable's gaze followed his, unblinking. For a moment, Mason felt the peculiar, unwelcome sensation of being guided not by orders, not by maps, but by something wordless that insisted it mattered. "Where'd you find this?" Mason whispered. Sable stood and walked to the door, then stopped again. The supply door. Mason's pulse slowed, the way it did before something hard, before a breach, before a choice. He didn't open the door, not yet. He pocketed the fabric, and for the rest of the day, he worked with the careful precision of a man who had just realized the ground under him might contain a hollow. When the sun began to lower, Briar Hollow turned gold. Light spilled through the windows, making dust motes drift like tiny planets. Mason finished his shift, signed nothing, promised nothing. Outside, the air cut cleanly into his lungs. Sable trotted beside him, calm now, as if the strange tension had never existed. They passed the side of the building where deliveries were unloaded. Snow was packed down into icy ruts, but the trees nearby stood tall and indifferent. Mason paused at the edge of the service yard, staring at the shadowed corner where the supply corridor met the outer wall. There was nothing there. No sound. No movement. Still, his skin felt subtly warned. He turned to leave. Sable stopped again. This time Sable stepped slightly ahead of Mason, positioning himself between Mason and the building, ears pricked forward. Mason frowned. "Sable?" Then it happened. A sharp crack wood under stress. A heavy beam above the service area groaned and broke loose from its resting point. It dropped in a fast, ugly arc, exactly where Mason would have been standing had Sable not shifted him half a step back. The beam hit the ground with a thud that vibrated through the snow. Dust puffed up in a pale cloud. For a second, the world held its breath. Mason stared at the beam, as then at the spot his boots had just left. Lena burst out the side door with Gordon behind her. "Oh my God!" Lena's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes were wide and wet with shock. "Are you okay?" Gordon's face tightened. He looked up at the broken support, then down at Sable, and something like grim understanding crossed his features. "Old place," he muttered. "Cold makes everything brittle." Mason didn't answer right away. He knelt and cupped Sable's face in gloved hands. The dog's breath was warm against his fingers. The amber eyes held steady, neither proud nor frightened, only present. Good, Mason said quietly. It was the only word that fit. Sable leaned into his hands once briefly, like a soldier acknowledging a salute. Lena exhaled shakily, half laughing out of relief. Your dog just saved your life. Mason's mouth tightened, but his eyes softened in a way most people never saw. He's been doing that, Mason said, for years. Gordon looked at Mason for a long moment, then nodded once. Some dogs don't retire, he said. They just change what they guard. As they walked away from the center, the lake ahead glowed with late sunlight, and the snow underfoot glittered like it had been scattered by careless gods. Mason felt the old discipline still inside him, unchanged, unbroken. But beneath it, something else stirred. A reluctant faith. Not faith in luck. Faith in a living creature who listened to things Mason couldn't hear anymore. Sable trotted beside him, tail low, steps sure. And Mason understood, with a clarity that was almost painful. Whatever he'd come here to escape, it hadn't escaped him. But perhaps, just perhaps, he hadn't come here only to hide. Perhaps he'd come here because something in this bright northern cold had decided he was still needed. And Sable, always ahead of him in the invisible terrain, had simply arrived first. Morning in Briar Hollow arrived clean and unapologetic. Sunlight slid across the frozen lake and struck the snow at an angle that made everything look deliberate, as if winter had arranged the town overnight and was now daring anyone to find fault with it. Mason stood on the cabin's narrow porch, breath slow, shoulders loose inside his worn tactical shirt, watching Sable track invisible lines across the yard. The dog moved with quiet intention. Nose low, tail neutral. Every few steps he paused, inhaled, adjusted course by inches. Not hunting. Reading. Mason recognized the behavior. It wasn't curiosity. It was verification. You're checking the world, Mason murmured, more to himself than the dog. Sable flicked an ear, but didn't look back. After yesterday, Mason had slept lightly. Not poorly, just thinly, like ice that held but warned. And every sound in the night had found him awake. Wind against the cabin, a branch shedding snow, the soft scrape of Sable shifting position near the door. The past had not returned in dreams. Instead, it had hovered in the margins of consciousness, polite enough not to intrude, confident enough to wait. He dressed the same way he always did. Same layers, same boots, same watch. There was comfort in repetition. Gear you trusted did not ask questions. At Northwind K9. Retirement and training. The day began with routine. Kennels were cleaned, food measured, medications checked against handwritten charts taped neatly to the walls. Mason worked without being told, falling into rhythm beside Gordon Pike, whose movements were slower but exact. Gordon's flannel was faded to softness, his boots practical and well-worn, his short gray beard trimmed in a way that suggested he still believed order mattered, even when no one was watching. They didn't talk much. When Gordon did speak, as it was in short observations, not explanations, "Cold makes joints lie," he said at one point, rubbing his knee before crouching beside a kennel. "Dogs feel it before we do." The kennel held an old Belgian Malinois named Rex, muzzle frosted white with age, eyes sharp but tired. Rex lifted his head as Mason approached, tail thumping once formal, restrained. Mason knelt, offering the back of his hand. Rex sniffed, approved, then rested his chin against the bars with a soft huff. "Still thinks he's on duty," Gordon said. Not fondly, respectfully. Mason nodded. "They don't forget the assignment." "No," Gordon agreed. "Just the reason." Later, Mason met Dr. Rowan Hale. She came in through the side entrance carrying a stainless steel case, her boots tracked with snow, her hair pulled back in a low, practical tie. Rowan was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with the posture of someone who spent long hours on her feet and longer hours holding still animals steady, and her skin was pale with a faint flush from the cold, her face sharp-boned without being severe. Dark hair, clear gray eyes, no jewelry except a thin chain tucked beneath her collar. She assessed Mason in one glance, not suspicious, evaluative. "You're the new hire," she said, voice calm, precise. "Temporary." "That's the plan," Mason replied. Her gaze dropped briefly to Sable, who sat beside Mason, ears forward, expression neutral. "And you brought your own credential," she added. Sable's tail moved once. Rowan crouched, careful not to crowd. "May I?" Mason nodded. She extended her hand slowly. Sable sniffed, then sat taller, allowing her closer. Rowan's fingers brushed his harness, light and professional. 5 years, she said quietly. Working line. Confident, not reactive. Her eyes flicked to Mason. "He listens to you." "He listens to the world," Mason said. "I just don't get in the way." Something in Rowan's expression shifted, not softened exactly, but aligned. "Good," she said. "That matters here." As the morning unfolded, Mason began to notice patterns. Dogs listed as pending transfer occupied the far row of kennels. Older, scarred, disciplined. The kind of dogs that didn't ask for affection, but accepted it carefully, as if it were a contract. The clipboard hung at the end of the aisle bore a neat column of names, dates, and destinations marked only by initials. No addresses, no return notes. Lena passed by, humming under her breath, dropping off supplies. She was bright as always, but Mason noticed the way her steps slowed near that row, how her eyes flicked away. "What happens to the transfers?" Mason asked, keeping his voice neutral. Lena hesitated. Just a fraction. "They go elsewhere," she said, then smiled too quickly. "You know, different programs." Mason nodded. He knew the sound of an answer that had been practiced for safety. At midday, one of the older dogs collapsed. Juno, a German Shepherd mix with a grizzled muzzle and cloudy eyes, went down during a slow walk in the yard. No panic. Just a sudden quiet surrender of weight. Rowan was there in seconds. Mason moved without thinking, supporting Juno's chest, easing him onto the ground. Juno's breath came shallow, uneven. Sable lay down beside him immediately, pressing flank to flank, warmth offered without ceremony. Rowan's hands were steady as she checked vitals. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. "Heart," she said. "He's been holding longer than anyone asked him to." They moved Juno inside. Blankets laid out. The room hushed in a way that felt reverent rather than urgent. Juno's eyes opened once. He looked at Sable, then at Mason. Then he slept. He didn't wake. The room remained quiet long after Rowan covered the body. Sable did not move. No one asked him to. Mason felt something in his chest loosen and ache at the same time. This was not combat grief. There was no adrenaline, no shock, just the slow recognition of an ending that had earned its dignity. Rowan finally straightened. Her shoulders rose, then settled. "We don't mark that on the clipboard," she said quietly. "Just update the count." Mason looked at the list again. Names. Numbers. Silence. That afternoon, while Mason was cleaning the far kennels alone, Sable stiffened. Not alarm. Attention. Mason followed the dog's gaze. At the end of the aisle, the clipboard stirred. There was no breeze, no open door. The metal clip shifted slightly, tapping once against the board. Sable rose, walked forward, and sat directly beneath it. He looked up. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. He stepped closer. The list was unchanged, but at the bottom, beneath the printed names, someone had added a line in pen. Not a name, just a date. Today's date. Mason exhaled slowly. Sable did not look away. The rest of the day passed with the careful normalcy of places that survive on routine. Rowan worked in silence. Gordon fixed a loose hinge. Lena organized donation forms, chatting with a volunteer about winter fundraisers. Life continued, as it always did, adjacent to questions no one wanted to phrase. As Mason locked up the kennels for the night, he paused at the row marked pending. Sable stood beside him, calm, observant. "Do you know something I don't?" Mason asked quietly. Sable's ears tilted back briefly, not fear, not warning. Recognition. Mason left the building as the sky turned pale gold. The lake reflected it faithfully. The town looked exactly as it had that morning. Peaceful, well-kept, deserving of trust. He walked home with Sable through the snow, mind occupied by small details. The date, the absence of destinations, the way Rowan's hands had trembled for half a second after Juno's passing. At the cabin, Sarah was clearing snow from the porch. She straightened as Mason approached, shovel resting against her shoulder. "You look like someone died," she said bluntly. Mason didn't deflect. "Someone did." Sarah nodded once. "Then you did the right thing by noticing." She glanced at Sable. "And you?" Sable met her gaze, steady. Sarah's mouth tightened, thoughtful. "Figures." Mason went inside, fed Sable, hung his jacket. The cabin was warm, quiet, safe. And yet, as he sat at the small kitchen table, Mason realized something had shifted. Not the world. Him. He had come north to disappear into usefulness, to exist without consequence. But the names he'd seen, and the ones he hadn't, did not allow for that. Sable lay at his feet, breathing slow, content. Mason stared at the wall, eyes unfocused. Some dogs didn't retire. Some soldiers didn't either. They just waited until something worth guarding appeared. And today, for the first time, Mason suspected that whatever lay ahead was already counting on him to notice. The snow along the lake had changed overnight. Mason noticed it before his boots touched it, before sound, before weight. The surface near the tree line no longer held the loose, crystalline scatter of fresh fall. It was pressed, compacted in long, shallow arcs that curved away from the road and disappeared between the pines. Vehicle tracks. Not the deep, confident grooves of town plows or delivery trucks. These were narrower, careful, as if whoever drove them had not wanted to announce their arrival or their departure. Sable paused beside Mason, head lowered, ears slightly back. His nose hovered inches above the snow, breath slow and controlled. He followed the edge of one track for several steps, then lifted his head and looked toward the forest. Mason didn't speak. He let the silence do its work. The morning was bright, painfully clear, and the sky had that washed winter blue that made every shadow sharp and honest. Briar Hollow lay behind them cabins, smoke curling from chimneys, the lake glinting like polished steel. Ahead, the forest stood dense and indifferent, trunks dark with cold. Mason exhaled through his nose. "Not town," he murmured. Sable's tail flicked once. Agreement. They didn't follow the tracks far. Not yet. Mason had learned the cost of impatience a long time ago. Instead, they turned back toward Northwind Canine. Retirement and training, the tracks etched into his mind like coordinates. Inside the center, the atmosphere felt different today. Not tense, quietly aligned. Rowan Hale was already there, sleeves rolled, hair secured more tightly than usual. Her movements were brisk, but Mason noticed the faint dark circles under her eyes, the kind that came from staying awake with thoughts that refused to be dismissed. "You saw it," she said without preamble, as Mason stepped inside. "Saw what?" Mason replied evenly. Rowan met his gaze. For a moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing something sharper beneath. "The pattern," she said. "You don't walk like someone who misses patterns." Mason considered her, then nodded once. "By the lake." Rowan's jaw tightened. "They've been using the forest road." Mason waited. "They don't bring trucks close to the building," she continued. "Too visible. Too many eyes. Instead, they move dogs at night, quietly, through the trees." Sable shifted beside Mason, nails clicking softly on the floor. "How long?" Mason asked. Rowan hesitated. That was answer enough. "Longer than I can prove," she said finally. "Longer than I'm proud of." Before Mason could respond, the back door opened and Cal Becker stepped in. Cal was in his early 40s, medium height, with a build that suggested a former athlete who'd traded training for management. His hair was sandy blonde, kept deliberately casual, his beard trimmed close, not scruffy, not formal. He smiled easily, the kind of smile that reached his mouth faster than his eyes. "Morning," Cal said, clapping his hands once. "Looks like we're all early." His gaze flicked to Sable, lingering just a beat too long. Mason felt it then, the same sensation he'd learned to trust in darker places. Not danger. Avoidance. Cal didn't dislike the dog. He disliked being seen by him. "Inventory day," Cal went on. "Let's keep things smooth, yeah?" Rowan inclined her head, neutral. Mason returned the nod. Cal moved on, his boots light on the floor. Sable watched him go, ears forward, body still. "Do you trust him?" Rowan asked quietly. Mason chose his words carefully. "I don't know him." Rowan nodded. "That's what worries me." The afternoon brought a break from the cold. Mason volunteered to walk a few of the older dogs, those whose joints protested concrete floors, but still craved the discipline of movement. Rex came along, steady but stiff, his breath frosting the air with each exhale. They followed a familiar loop toward the woods. Halfway in, Sable veered slightly off path. Mason felt it instantly, the subtle shift in pace, the change in tension along the leash. "What is it?" he asked. Sable stopped near a stand of young pines. The snow here was disturbed, flattened into irregular ovals. Footprints. Human. Boots. They led deeper into the trees. Mason scanned the surroundings. The forest absorbed sound. Even Rex seemed to sense the change, his ears rotating, posture alert despite his age. Mason crouched, gloved fingers brushing the snow. The tracks overlapped in places, purposeful but cautious. Someone had walked backward here. Someone trained. A voice cut through the trees. "Hey, sir!" Mason rose slowly, hand open, posture non-threatening. A boy emerged from behind a fallen log, and he couldn't have been more than 12 Eli Mercer, thin, all elbows and knees, bundled in a jacket too big for him, dark hair sticking out from beneath a knit cap. His cheeks were flushed red from the cold, eyes bright with a mix of curiosity and nerves. "I didn't mean to scare you," Eli blurted. "I was just walking." "Alone?" Mason asked. Eli shrugged. "Not really. I come out here a lot." His gaze locked onto the dogs. Awe replaced uncertainty. "They're working dogs," Eli said reverently. "Aren't they?" "Yes," Mason replied. Eli edged closer, respectful but fascinated. "I saw a truck here last night." Mason's attention sharpened. "Where?" Eli pointed. "Down by the old logging road. No lights, just parked. Then it left." "How late?" Mason asked. Eli scrunched his face. "After dinner. Before my mom got home." Mason nodded. "You did good telling me." Eli puffed up slightly at the praise, then hesitated. "You think they're stealing dogs?" Mason didn't answer right away. "Well, I think," he said carefully, "some people forget dogs can't tell their own stories." Eli's jaw set. "That's not fair." "No," Mason agreed. "It's not." Rex gave a low, quiet huff, as if punctuating the statement. They walked back together, Eli talking animatedly about school, about wanting to train dogs someday, about how Sable looked like he knew secrets. Mason listened, cataloging details, the way he always had. At the edge of the property, Eli stopped. "I shouldn't say this," he said, lowering his voice, "but I think they go to the lake first, then the woods." Mason nodded once. "That's important." Eli grinned, then jogged off toward town, boots slipping slightly in the snow. That evening, as Mason returned alone to the lake, the light had shifted. The sun dipped low, throwing amber across the ice. The forest reflected dark and still in the frozen surface. Sable stopped at the water's edge, not to sniff, to listen. His ears lifted. His body went rigid, not alert like before, but reverent, as if something unseen had passed through the air. Mason followed Sable's gaze across the lake. For a brief moment the ice cracked, a sharp, clean sound that echoed across the hollow. Then silence. Mason's breath caught, not because of the sound, but because Sable had sat, faced the forest, and waited. The days that followed brought small confirmations. A delivery log missing a line, a gate latch loosened and resecured, a scent of antiseptic where it didn't belong. Rowan grew quieter, more focused. Cal grew friendlier, his smiles wider, his explanations longer. Mason watched, listened, learned. At night, he walked the perimeter with Sable, tracing the invisible boundary between safety and assumption. The lake remained frozen. The forest remained still. But Mason knew better now than to trust stillness. On the fourth evening, as they headed home, Sable paused again this time, near the narrow trail leading up into the hills. His posture softened slightly, curiosity mixed with certainty. Mason stood beside him, watching the shadows stretch. He thought of the names on the clipboard, of Juno, of the boy who'd noticed what adults ignored, of tracks that did not belong to anyone official. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine coughed, then went silent. Mason rested a hand on Sable's harness. "Not tonight," he said quietly. Sable didn't move. They stood there until the cold deepened, until the light was gone, until the forest offered no more answers. When they finally turned back toward Briar Hollow, Mason understood something with a clarity that settled deep in his bones. Whatever was happening here was careful, and careful things did not stop unless someone stood in their way. Winter tightened its grip on Briar Hollow without drama. No blizzards, no warnings, just a steady drop in temperature that made metal ache and wood complain. The lake held firm, ice thickening with each clear night. Snow no longer glittered, it absorbed sound, swallowed footsteps, made secrets easier to carry. Mason felt the shift in his joints before he felt it in the air. At Northwind K9, retirement and training. The routines continued, but something underneath them had begun to grind. Doors were closed more often, conversations shortened. The building felt watched, not by people, but by its own walls. Mason worked through the morning without comment. He cleaned, fed, walked dogs whose names he now knew by heart. Rex still demanded a precise pace. A shepherd named Kara knew to him, lean and silver-faced. Aim's scars, threading her muzzle like old writing, refused to sit unless Mason met her eyes first. She was older than Sable, calmer, and carried herself with the contained dignity of a dog who had learned that patience could outlast commands. Sable noticed everything. He lingered near thresholds. He tracked scents that Mason could not. He slept lightly, ears twitching even in rest. Late morning, Mason found Rowan in the small medical room, sterilizing instruments that were already clean. She moved methodically, shoulders squared, dark hair pulled tight. Her face was composed, but her eyes had the faraway focus of someone rehearsing an argument they hoped not to have. "You're early," Mason said. Rowan didn't look up. "I didn't sleep." Mason waited. "They moved 2 dogs last night," she said finally. "Officially." "Officially," Mason repeated. "They were marked as relocation, paperwork clean, signatures present." Her hands paused. Destinations? Vague?" Mason leaned against the counter, arms loose. "And unofficially?" Rowan exhaled through her nose. "They weren't ready. One had a respiratory issue. Another shouldn't have been transported in this cold." Sable shifted at Mason's side, tail low, ears forward. Rowan's gaze dropped to him. "He knows. He knows something's wrong," Mason said. "He doesn't know what." Rowan finally met Mason's eyes. "I do." She straightened, wiped her hands, and nodded toward the door. "Walk with me." They stepped outside into the pale winter light. The air bit cleanly at Mason's lungs. Rowan led him along the back of the building, past the fenced yard, toward the edge of the property where the trees thickened. "There's an old sawmill beyond the tree line," Rowan said. "Been abandoned for years. Before Northwind expanded, the previous owner used one of the outbuildings as storage." "For what?" Mason asked. Rowan's mouth tightened. "For animals that needed to be out of sight." They stopped near a break in the trees. The path beyond was narrow, snow-packed, clearly used but rarely discussed. "I've raised concerns," Rowan said. "Formally, informally. I've documented discrepancies. I've been told not to look too closely." "By who?" Mason asked. Rowan hesitated. That hesitation answered more than words. Before Mason could press further, footsteps crunched behind them. Cal Becker approached, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, breath puffing white. He looked comfortable in the cold, too comfortable. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes bright with practiced ease. "There you are," Cal said, smiling. "I was wondering where my two hardest workers disappeared to." Rowan's expression closed like a door. "We're talking." Cal laughed softly. "That's allowed, last I checked." His gaze flicked to Sable again. "You keeping him on a short leash, Mason?" Mason met Cal's eyes. He didn't smile. "He keeps himself." Cal held the look a beat too long, then shrugged. "Inventory's tight. We need everyone focused. Winter funding reviews are coming up." Rowan folded her arms. "Funding doesn't justify risking animals." Cal's smile thinned. "No one's risking anything." Sable stepped half a pace forward, not aggressive, not warning, positioning. Cal noticed. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "We'll discuss this later," Cal said, voice still pleasant. "Inside." He turned and walked away without waiting for agreement. Rowan watched him go, jaw set. "That," she said quietly, "is not how someone reacts when they have nothing to hide." Mason nodded once. The path to the old sawmill was easier to find than Mason expected. Snow had been cleared there recently, just enough to keep access, not enough to draw attention. The outbuilding sat low and squat, wood gray with age, roof sagging under accumulated frost. The place smelled wrong even before they reached it, antiseptic layered over rot, metal, and old animal fear. Mason didn't touch the door. He didn't need to. Sable stood at the threshold, hackles neither raised nor flat alert, in a way that spoke of memory, not threat. His nose traced the air, mapping what had passed through. "Used recently," Mason murmured. Rowan swallowed. "I shouldn't be here." "You're here," Mason said. "That counts." They didn't go inside. Not yet. Mason noted the ground, the marks where snow had been compressed and disturbed. He counted footsteps, spacing, direction. Whoever used this place knew how to move quickly and cleanly. As they turned back, Mason felt it, the sense of being observed. He stopped. Rowan followed his gaze. At the edge of the trees, partially obscured by branches, stood Eli Mercer. The boy looked smaller out here, jacket swallowed by the forest, cheeks red from cold. He froze when he realized he'd been seen. Mason lifted a hand, palm open. "You shouldn't be here." Eli shuffled forward anyway. "I heard the dogs," he said, "at night, from my window." Rowan's eyes softened despite herself. "What did you hear?" Mason asked. "Not barking," Eli said. "Just movement, like crates and engines." Mason nodded. "You did right telling us." Eli glanced toward the outbuilding. "That place scares me." "Good," Mason said gently. "It should." That evening, back at the center, Mason stayed late. The building settled into its nighttime quiet radiators ticking, distant wind pressing against windows. Sable lay near the office door, eyes closed but ears active. Mason reviewed logs, delivery times, names. Then Sable stood. No sound. No urgency. He walked to the office window and stared out into the dark. Mason followed his line of sight. Across the yard, near the loading area, a single light flicked on then off. Mason's pulse slowed. "Someone's here," he whispered. Sable did not move. He watched. The light did not return. Mason waited another 10 minutes before locking up. Outside, The cold had deepened. His breath fogged, then vanished. As they walked home, the town felt altered, not hostile, but alert. Snow muffled sound, but Mason imagined it carrying vibrations just the same. At the cabin, Sarah was on the porch again, tightening a loose board. Her silver blonde hair was braided tonight, practical and neat. She glanced up as Mason approached. "You're late," she observed. "Work," Mason replied. Sarah studied his face. "Work that follows you home?" Mason didn't answer. She nodded, as if that was confirmation enough. "Cold like this brings things to the surface," she said. "Cracks, weak joints. People, too." Sable sat beside Mason, looking out toward the trees. Sarah's gaze followed. "He's watching something." "So am I," Mason said. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than it had the night before. Not unsafe, just occupied by thoughts that took up space. Mason fed Sable, and then sat at the table, maps and notes spread before him. He didn't plan yet. He observed. He waited. Winter pressed in from all sides, patient and relentless. Mason understood now that it wasn't just a season. It was pressure. And pressure revealed what had been hidden. The wind changed its mind overnight. It no longer flowed across Briar Hollow. It pressed. Against windows. Against doors. Against the quiet agreements people made with themselves when they believed no one was watching. Mason felt it before he opened his eyes. Sable was already awake, seated near the door, posture upright but relaxed. His ears were angled forward, not toward any single sound, but toward possibility. The dog's breath rose and fell in a steady rhythm, a metronome Mason had come to trust more than his own pulse. "Something's coming," Mason murmured. Sable didn't react. He didn't need to. This wasn't a warning, it was acknowledgement. At Northwind, the day began under a low sky, clouds heavy with unshed snow. The center was quieter than usual. Too quiet. Fewer volunteers. Fewer greetings. Even the dogs seemed subdued, and their movements economical, voices restrained. Rowan met Mason near the supply room. She looked more rigid today, spine straight, jaw set, eyes sharp. Her dark hair was tied back tighter than usual, pulling the lines of her face into clarity. "They're auditing," she said under her breath. "Who?" Mason asked. "Regional oversight," Rowan replied. "Unscheduled, which means someone asked for it, or someone's trying to look clean." Mason nodded. "Which dogs?" Rowan swallowed. "3. She handed him a clipboard. Different from the others. New. Too new. Sable sniffed the edge, then turned his head away. Mason noticed. The inspection team arrived just before noon. 2 men and 1 woman stepped out of a state-marked SUV. The lead inspector, Harold Vance, was in his late 50s, tall and narrow, his gray hair combed back with almost ceremonial care. His face bore the grooves of someone who smiled rarely and professionally. He shook hands without warmth, his eyes cataloging details faster than his words suggested. The woman, Janice Moore, was younger, early 40s, stocky, bundled against the cold. Her face was open, but her eyes were cautious. She had learned the cost of misplaced trust. The third man, Evan Rusk, barely spoke. He wore glasses, carried a tablet, and observed everything from half a step behind the others, as if he preferred the margin. Cal Becker greeted them like old friends, too eagerly. Mason watched the way Cal laughed, the way his hands moved when he spoke, open, disarming, practiced. This wasn't panic, it was performance. Rowan remained professional, polite. distant. Mason stayed where he was told, and nowhere else. The inspection moved quickly. Kennels, records, clean spaces, approved protocols. No one asked about the sawmill. No one asked about the forest road. When it was over, Vance nodded once, curt. "We'll be in touch." Cal smiled wide enough for everyone. The SUV drove away, those tires crunching over packed snow. The moment it disappeared, the building exhaled. Rowan leaned against the counter, one hand pressed flat against the steel surface. "They didn't see," she said. Not relief, not disappointment, something closer to dread. "They weren't looking," Mason replied. That afternoon, Rowan pulled Mason aside. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I didn't tell you." Sable lifted his head. Rowan glanced at him, then continued. "I checked the harness Cal had replaced on your dog." Mason stilled. "What about it?" "It wasn't standard," Rowan said. "The stitching pattern was wrong. The material was heavier than it needed to be." Mason felt the shift instantly. "Meaning?" "Meaning there was room to hide something." Sable stood. Rowan lowered her voice. "I didn't find it at first. Only after I cut the inner seam." Mason didn't ask her what she'd found. He already knew. "A tracker," Rowan said. "Low frequency, passive. Not GPS, something closer to proximity tagging." "Like inventory," Mason said. Rowan nodded. "Like cargo." Sable moved closer to Mason, pressing his shoulder into his leg, not seeking comfort, offering alignment. Mason crouched, hand steady as he examined the harness. The cut seam was barely visible now, carefully re-sewn. "How long?" he asked. Rowan hesitated. "Since the day it was upgraded." Mason exhaled slowly. Anger didn't spike. It settled. Dense. Controlled. "They wanted to know where I go," he said. "No," Rowan replied. "They wanted to know where your dog goes." That night, Mason walked the perimeter alone. Sable moved without leash, staying close but not constrained. The moon was thin, the snow reflecting just enough light to keep the forest from swallowing detail. They followed the narrow trail toward the hills, careful not to leave fresh prints. Mason felt the old awareness return, not the adrenaline of combat, but the clarity of preparation. At the ridge overlooking the old sawmill, Sable stopped. He sniffed the air, then circled once. Mason knelt, brushing snow aside with gloved hands. There, barely visible. Tire impressions. Fresh. The pattern of a vehicle that had reversed into place, lingered, then left. Mason closed his eyes briefly. "They're not just moving dogs," he said quietly. "They're staging." Sable looked at him. For the first time since arriving in Briar Hollow, Mason felt the unmistakable sensation of being chosen, not by fate, not by duty, but by circumstance that refused to leave him alone. As Mason turned to leave, Sable froze. Every muscle locked, head lifted, ears forward. Not alert, not alarmed. Focused. Mason followed Sable's gaze across the frozen clearing. At the edge of the sawmill yard, something moved. A figure stepped briefly into moonlight, then back again. Too tall to be a child, too still to be a worker. Mason's heart rate didn't change, but the figure raised a hand, not waving, signaling. Then it was gone. Sable remained motionless long after the space was empty. The following day brought no confrontation. Cal acted as if nothing had changed. He joked. He offered coffee. He praised Mason's work with practiced generosity. Rowan documented everything. Quietly. Thoroughly. Eli stopped by the fence after school, bundled and breathless. "They were there again," he whispered. "Last night." "Where?" Mason asked. "The hill road," Eli said. "Same truck, different plates." Mason nodded. "You did right." Eli hesitated. "You're not scared, are you?" Mason considered the question. "No," he said honestly. "I'm ready." That evening, Mason removed the tracker completely. He held the small black disc in his palm, feeling its useless weight. He buried it beneath the ice at the lake's edge, cracking through the surface just enough to slip it under. Sable watched, tail still. When Mason stood, the wind rose, a sharp and cold, whipping across the frozen water. The north wind didn't howl, it whispered. Mason turned toward home, Sable at his side. He understood now. This wasn't about exposing wrongdoing. It was about choosing what kind of man he would be when the line between witness and action finally disappeared. And the wind, old and knowing, had already made its choice. The inside of the outbuilding did not feel abandoned. It felt paused. Mason understood the difference the moment the door sealed behind them. The air was stale, but not dead-layered with disinfectant, cold metal, and the faint, unmistakable tang of fear that lingered long after its source had learned to be quiet. The single overhead bulb hummed weakly, throwing shadows that clung to corners as if they preferred not to be seen. Sable stepped in first, paws silent on the concrete. His body language shifted immediately, shoulders forward, spine aligned, the measured calm of a working animal entering a space that demanded discipline. He did not rush. He assessed. Mason followed, senses narrowing. Crates lined one wall, some empty, some not. The occupied ones were arranged with careful spacing, as if whoever placed them understood airflow and stress, containment. Mason felt a cold, familiar anger settle low in his chest. This was not chaos. This was procedure. A sound came from the far end of the room. Soft, rhythmic, breathing. Mason moved slowly, signaling Sable to hold. His boots made no noise as he rounded the corner. That was when he saw her. The mother dog lay curled against the back wall, her body forming a protective arc around two small shapes pressed into her chest. She was a German shepherd older, maybe 8 or 9, with a coat once rich and dark, now dulled by age and neglect. Snow clung to her fur in clotted patches, melting slowly against her warmth. Her ribs showed beneath the thick winter coat, and her hind leg bore a faint limp that suggested an injury healed without kindness. Her eyes were amber like Sable's, but clouded with exhaustion. Still, when she lifted her head, they were fierce. The puppies stirred at her movement, no more than a few weeks old. Too young to understand cages. One was darker, black and tan, round-eyed and trembling. The other was lighter, cream-flecked, its breath coming in tiny, determined bursts. The mother shifted, placing herself more squarely between them and the open space. Sable stopped beside Mason. He did not growl. He sat. The mother dog watched him, muscles tense, lips pulled back just enough to warn. Not aggression. Boundary. Mason lowered himself to a crouch, palms open. Breath slow. "It's okay," he said softly, though he knew words were not what mattered. Sable leaned forward, head low, eyes gentle but unwavering. He did not break eye contact. He communicated in posture, in stillness, in the shared language of animals who had learned that silence could be more persuasive than force. The mother dog's growl faded into a breath. She did not relax, but she allowed Sable closer. Mason felt something in his chest twist painfully. He had seen this before, in villages half a world away, and in mothers who placed themselves between danger and children because there was no one else left to do it. He rose slowly and moved to check the crates along the wall. One was marked with a faded tag. No name, just a number. "They weren't supposed to be here," Mason whispered. Sable flicked an ear. Mason found the vent near the ceiling a few minutes later. Narrow, rusted, partially obscured by a hanging tarp. It led upward, toward the slope behind the sawmill toward air, light, and snow. Too small for an adult. Barely wide enough for a child, but enough for puppies. Mason turned back toward the dogs. The mother watched him closely now, eyes tracking every movement. He crouched again, gesturing gently toward the vent. "I can get them out," he murmured. "Not all of us. But them." The mother dog's ears tilted. She looked at the vent, then at her pups, her body tensed. She did not move. Sable rose. He approached her with deliberate care, then lay down, exposing his side, an unmistakable sign of trust and of shared purpose. He did not look at the puppies. He looked at her. Mason held his breath. The mother dog made a low sound, something between a whine and a sigh. She nudged the darker pup forward with her nose. Then the lighter one. Decision made. Mason moved quickly then, removing his jacket and wrapping it around the puppies, shielding them from the cold metal as he lifted them gently. They squeaked softly, tiny protests quickly stilled by warmth and the steady presence of Sable watching from below. Mason boosted himself up, reaching the vent, hands scraping against rust. He guided the bundled pups through the opening, listening for the sound of snow, of air. A small voice echoed faintly from outside. "Here." Eli Mercer's voice. Mason closed his eyes briefly in relief. He lowered the bundle carefully. The puppies disappeared into the cold daylight, Eli's excited whisper muffled by distance. Mason dropped back to the floor. The mother dog rose immediately, limping forward, pressing her head into Mason's chest with a force that surprised him. Not gratitude, acknowledgement. He rested his forehead briefly against hers. "I'll come back," he said quietly. He did not know if that was true. The sound came from above boots on metal, not hurried, measured. Mason straightened instantly. Sable was already on his feet, body angled toward the door, eyes dark and focused. A voice drifted down from the stairs outside the outbuilding. Calm. Familiar. "Inventory doesn't match," Cal Becker said conversationally. "That tends to happen when people get curious." Mason's pulse slowed. Cal's silhouette appeared in the doorway, framed by pale light. He looked the same as always, clean jacket, trimmed beard, easy posture, but his eyes were sharper now, stripped of pretense. "You should have left when you had the chance," Cal said. Mason stepped forward, positioning himself between Cal and the dogs. Sable mirrored him. Cal glanced at the mother dog, then back at Mason. "You don't understand the scale of this." "I understand enough," Mason replied. Cal sighed. "Then you know this ends badly." Mason did not answer. He reached into his pocket. Not for a weapon. For the small flash drive Rowan had given him hours earlier, the one containing logs, edits, timestamps. Cal noticed. His expression changed. Sirens cut through the cold moments later. Distant, then closer. Cal's jaw tightened. He took a step back, calculating. Sable moved. not toward Cal, toward the crates. He began barking, not wild, not frantic, but sharp, rhythmic. A signal. The sound echoed through the building, carrying beyond it. The mother dog pressed herself into the corner, watching Mason with eyes that burned. Mason met her gaze. "I didn't forget," he said softly. Cal cursed under his breath and bolted for the door. Mason did not pursue. The sirens grew louder, the sound of authority, of interruption. When the doors finally opened again, it was with force. Lights flooded the room. Voices called out. Hands reached for the crates. The mother dog did not resist when Mason approached her again. She leaned into him, weight heavy, trust complete. Sable sat beside them, chest heaving slightly, eyes alert but calm. Outside, the cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. Mason felt it then, not victory, not relief, but something closer to alignment. He had not chosen this fight, but he had not turned away, and in the end, that was enough. Morning returned to Briar Hollow without asking permission. Snow fell lightly during the night, not enough to bury what had happened, just enough to soften the edges. The lake lay pale and quiet, ice intact, reflecting a sky that looked almost too innocent for a place that had recently learned the weight of truth. Mason stood on the porch of the cabin, hands wrapped around a chipped mug Sarah had wordlessly pressed into him an hour earlier. Steam rose, vanished. The cold bit through fabric, through memory, through the thin armor of routine. Sable lay at his feet, head resting on crossed paws, eyes half closed, but listening. He had slept deeply for the first time in days. Not the exhausted sleep of collapse, but the steady rest of a task completed. Not finished. Completed. Sirens had come and gone the night before. Vehicles, voices, paperwork, the cold authority of flashlights cutting through darkness. Mason remembered it all with a strange distance, as if the events belonged to another man wearing his clothes. Cal Becker had vanished into the trees before law enforcement reached the sawmill. That fact sat heavily, unresolved. But Mason did not chase it yet. Some threads required patience. Inside the cabin, Sarah moved with deliberate calm, setting food out for Sable, stacking wood by the stove. She was dressed the way she always was, heavy sweater, worn jeans, boots scuffed at the toes. Her silver blonde hair was braided down her back today, a practical line against her spine. Her skin, pale and weathered, held the faint redness of cold exposure. Her eyes missed nothing. "They'll be back," she said, not looking at him. "Officials, media, people who want to ask questions they should have asked sooner." Mason nodded. "I know." Sarah finally turned, studying him. "You didn't come here to be found." "No," Mason said. "I came here to stop running." She gave a short, humorless smile. "Funny how those look the same at first." At Northwind K9 Retirement and Training, the gates were open. Not wide, not ceremonial, just open. Rowan Hale stood near the main yard, clipboard tucked under one arm, her posture straighter than Mason had ever seen it. She looked exhausted dark shadows beneath her eyes, lips pressed thin, but there was something new there too. Relief, edged with grief. "They're placing holds on all transfers," she said as Mason approached. "State oversight is stepping in. Full audit." "Good," Mason replied. Rowan glanced down at Sable, who sat calmly at Mason's side. "You saved more than you know." Mason shook his head. He did. Rowan didn't argue. Beyond the yard, a temporary enclosure had been set up. Blankets, heat lamps, crates with doors open instead of shut. The mother dog lay inside one of them, and her body finally stretched out instead of curled tight. Her coat had been brushed, snow removed, wounds cleaned. The limp remained, but she rested now without tension, her breathing slow and even. The puppies slept against her belly, round and impossibly small, their sides rising and falling in perfect, fragile rhythm. Sable approached the enclosure slowly. The mother dog lifted her head. Their eyes met. For a moment, the world narrowed to that exchange. Then the mother dog lowered her head again, acceptance. Sable sat and watched over them, silent and vigilant, as if assuming a watch that had been handed off without words. Mason felt something loosen in his chest that he had kept locked down for years. Gordon Pike shuffled over, hands tucked into his coat sleeves. He looked older today. Not weaker, just unburdened. "They're calling this place something new," Gordon said quietly. "Northwind Paws, community supported, retirement, recovery, adoption." Mason glanced around. Volunteers moved in measured coordination. Local folks Mason had seen at the cafe, at the dock, at the feed store, people who had once looked away, were now present. Carrying supplies, asking questions, offering hands. "About time," Mason said. Gordon nodded. "About damn time." Later that afternoon, a small service was held near the lake. Not official, no speeches, no flags, just a few people standing in the cold, hats off, breath visible, honoring the dogs who had not made it to this morning. Rowan read the names aloud. Not numbers. Names. When she reached Juno, Mason felt Sable shift beside him. The dog did not whine. He did not bark. He simply leaned into Mason's leg, grounding him in the present. Snow drifted gently as the last name was spoken. Silence followed. Not awkward, not empty. Complete. As the group dispersed, Sable lifted his head sharply. Not alert. Attentive. Mason followed his gaze. At the far edge of the property, beyond the fence, a vehicle had stopped. A truck. White. Clean. No markings. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Middle-aged, broad-shouldered, dressed plainly. He did not approach. He simply stood by the truck, one hand resting on the door, watching. Sable remained still. Mason's eyes narrowed. The man raised a hand not in greeting, not in warning. Acknowledgement. Then he returned to the truck and drove away. Mason exhaled slowly. Rowan noticed his expression. "What is it?" "Someone else is watching," Mason said. "Not today's problem." She studied him. "But it will be." Mason nodded. "Eventually." That evening, the cabin felt different. Warmer. Not because of the fire, because it was no longer temporary. Mason sat at the small table, reviewing paperwork Rowan had dropped off earlier. Adoption forms. Care schedules. Plans. Sable lay nearby, paws twitching faintly in sleep. Sarah poured 2 glasses of whiskey and slid one across to Mason. "You staying?" she asked, not looking at him. Mason considered the question carefully. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Not harsh, not demanding. North wind. Steady. Familiar. "Yes," he said. "For now." Sarah lifted her glass. "Good. This place could use a man who doesn't look away." Mason took a sip, the burn grounding. Later, he stepped outside one last time before bed. The sky was clear, stars sharp. The lake held the light like a promise. Sable joined him, sitting at his side, shoulder brushing Mason's leg. "You did good," Mason said softly. Sable did not wag. He simply stayed. Mason thought of the years he'd spent guarding perimeters that never thanked him, of missions that ended without ceremony, of silence that followed. Here, there were no medals, just breath, warmth, names spoken aloud. He realized then that retirement, real retirement, was not about rest. It was about belonging. Mason reached down, resting his hand on Sable's harness. Whatever came next, whoever else might be watching, it could wait. For now, the last guardians had a place to sleep. And the night, for once, asked nothing more of them. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, on 4 tired legs, through instinct, loyalty, and a heart that refuses to look away. God does not always remove the storm. Often, He sends someone or something strong enough to stand inside it. In a world that moves fast and forgets easily, this story is a reminder. Pay attention to the small warnings. Listen to the quiet truths. Protect those who cannot speak for themselves. If this story touched something in you, do not let that feeling pass unnoticed. Carry it into your daily life. Be kinder than required. Be braver than comfortable. And when you see something wrong, do not turn away. If you believe stories like this matter, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. Subscribe to the channel so more voices, more truths, and more quiet miracles can be seen and heard. May God watch over you and your loved ones. May He guide your steps, protect your heart, and bless your days with purpose. And may you always recognize the miracle when it walks beside you. Thank you for watching.